In his 19th letter, Screwtape continues on the subject of love and marriage. He starts by addressing a not-so-innocent question that Wormwood asked in his last letter.
I have been thinking very hard about the question in your last letter. If, as I have clearly shown, all selves are by their very nature in competition, and therefore the enemy's idea of love is a contradiction in terms, what becomes of my reiterated warning that he really loves the human vermin, and really desires their freedom and continued existence? I hope, my dear boy, you have not shown my letters to anyone. Not that it matters, of course. Anyone would see that the apparent heresy into which I have fallen is purely accidental. By the way, I hope you understood, too, that some of the apparently uncomplimentary references to Slubglob were purely jocular. I really have the highest respect for him. And of course, some things I said about not shielding you from the authorities were not seriously meant. You can trust me to look after your interests. But do keep everything under lock and key.
Apparently, Wormwood asked a loaded question. The question exposed a logical inconsistency in Screwtape's comment that God really loves the human beings. This is supposedly impossible. At least it's contrary to the orthodoxy of hell, and could, if reported, get Screwtape into some hot water. Screwtape's opening clearly illustrates the consequences of living out of the philosophy of hell. There's no such thing as love. You gotta watch out for everyone, even family members, because they'll throw you under the bus to gain any kind of advantage over you. That's what life is like if to be means to be in competition, so Screwtape is justifiably worried.
The truth is, I slipped by mere carelessness into saying that the enemy really loves the humans. That, of course, is an impossibility. He is one being, they are distinct from him. Their good cannot be his. All his talk about love must be a disguise for something else. He must have some real motive for creating them and taking so much trouble about them. The reason one comes to talk as if he really had this impossible love is our utter failure to find out that real motive. What does he stand to make out of them? That is the insoluble question.
Screwtape has to do some backpedaling. Since love cannot exist, behaving in a loving way must have other motives. And what drives the devils nuts is that they can't figure out what that motive is.
I do not see that it can do any harm to tell you that this very problem was a chief cause of our father's quarrel with the enemy. When the creation of man was first mooted, and when, even at that stage, the enemy freely confessed that he foresaw a certain episode about a cross, our father very naturally sought an interview and asked for an explanation. The enemy gave no reply except to produce a cock-and-bull story about disinterested love, which he has been circulating ever since.
From Satan on down, the devils just don't get it. And by not getting something so enormously significant, the devils fall into an error that is just as enormously significant.
This our father naturally could not accept. He implored the enemy to lay his cards on the table and gave him every opportunity. He admitted that he felt a real anxiety to know the secret. The enemy replied, "I wish with all my heart that you did." It was, I imagine, at this stage in the interview that our father's disgust at such an unprovoked lack of confidence caused him to remove himself an infinite distance from the presence with a suddenness which has given rise to the ridiculous enemy story that he was forcibly thrown out of heaven.
This is consistent with what Lewis writes elsewhere, the idea that God does not throw us or anyone out of heaven. Anyone who is not in heaven is not there because they have chosen to be elsewhere. Heaven is where God is. Some people don't want to be where God is.
Since then, we have begun to see why our oppressor was so secretive. His throne depends on the secret. Members of his faction have frequently admitted that if ever we came to understand what he means by love, the war would be over and we should re-enter heaven. And there lies the great task. We know that he cannot really love. Nobody can. It doesn't make sense. If we could only find out what he is really up to.
This whole passage is built on irony. God and the angels are telling the devils the absolute truth, that if they understood love, there would be no war. The whole philosophy of hell is built on a faulty premise. That premise, love doesn't exist. So all their efforts have been nothing more than tragic.
Hypothesis after hypothesis has been tried, and still we can't find out. Yet we must never lose hope. More and more complicated theories, fuller and fuller collections of data, richer rewards for researchers who make progress, more and more terrible punishments for those who fail. All this, pursued and accelerated to the very end of time, cannot surely fail to succeed.
Screwtape then turns to another point, prompted by a complaint by Wormwood.
You complain that my last letter does not make it clear whether I regard being in love as a desirable state for a human or not. But really, Wormwood, That is the sort of question one expects them to ask. Leave them to discuss whether love, or patriotism, or celibacy, or candles on altars, or teetotalism, or education are good or bad. Can't you see there's no answer? Nothing matters at all except the tendency of a given state of mind, in given circumstances, to move a particular patient at a particular moment nearer to the enemy or nearer to us.
It's fitting that we get this speech here. We spend so much time thinking, is this better or is that better? We let the answer to this question define who we are. So it's hugely important to us. We define what it means to be a Christian by the answers to these questions. Choose whatever issue you want. Screwtape tells us that these types of things don't matter. The only thing that matters is our state of mind. Screwtape explains, expanding on the love, not love issue.
It would be quite a good thing to make the patient decide that love is good or bad. If he is an arrogant man with a contempt for the body really based on delicacy but mistaken by him for purity, and one who takes pleasure in flouting what most of his fellows approve, by all means let him decide against love. Instill in him an overweening asceticism, and then, when you have separated his sexuality from all that might humanize it, weigh in on him with it in some much more brutal and cynical form.
That's how the devils use the not love position to draw us away from heaven. How about the pro-love position?
If, on the other hand, he is an emotional, gullible man, feed him on the minor poets and fifth-rate novelists of the old school, until you have made him believe that love is both irresistible and somehow intrinsically meritorious. This belief is not much help, I grant you, in producing casual unchastity, but it is an incomparable recipe for prolonged noble, romantic, tragic adulteries ending, if all goes well, in murders and suicides.
Screwtape then moves on to the topic of marriage. He concedes that it's God's invention, but it does have some uses for tempters.
There must be several young women in your patient's neighborhood who would render the Christian life intensely difficult to him, if only you could persuade him to marry one of them. Please send me a report on this when you next write. In the meantime, get it quite clear in your own mind that this state of falling in love is not, in itself, necessarily favorable either to us or to the other side. It is simply an occasion which we and the enemy are both trying to exploit. Like most of the other things which humans are excited about, such as health and sickness, age and youth, or war and peace, it is, from the viewpoint of spiritual life, mainly raw material. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape.
Thus ends Screwtape's 19th letter. Thank you, and we will see you at the 20th.